The blood on her hands had long since frozen, but Abigail Kensington could still see the crimson stains against her pale skin as she sat beside the stream, watching ice crystals form along its edges in the late afternoon light of February 1878. She had been running for 3 days through the mountains of Colorado, and now she simply had no strength left to continue, her body surrendering to the cold even as her mind screamed at her to keep moving, to put more distance between herself and the men who had killed her father and burned their homestead to the ground. The sun was beginning its descent behind the towering peaks when she heard the crunch of snow behind her, but she could not even muster the energy to turn around or reach for the empty rifle lying useless beside her in the snow. If they had found her, then perhaps it was simply meant to be, and the exhaustion that had seeped into her very bones made the thought of struggling seem impossible. Owen Lawson had been checking his trap lines in the high country when he spotted the figure hunched beside Willow Creek, and something about the stillness of the form made him approach cautiously, one hand resting on the knife at his belt. As he drew closer, he realized it was a woman, young and slender, her dark hair tangled with pine needles and her clothes torn and mudded despite the cold. She did not move when he approached, and for a moment he feared she might already be dead, frozen in place like a tragic sculpture. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed, shallow and slow, and he made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. Without speaking, Owen lowered himself to sit beside her in the snow, close enough that she would know another human was present, far enough that he would not startle her if she was as frightened as he suspected. He had lived in these mountains for 8 years, ever since the war had ended, and he had found he could no longer stomach the company of civilized men with their lies and their politics. In that time, he had learned that silence often spoke louder than words, and that sometimes a soul in pain needed nothing more than the quiet presence of another to begin the slow journey back to themselves. They sat together as the light faded from gold to silver to the deep purple of mountain twilight, and Owen remained perfectly still beside her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet with shoulders broad as an axe handle and arms thick with muscle from years of chopping wood, hauling water, and wrestling with the untamed wilderness. His dark blonde hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen both the best and worst that life could offer. At 28, he was in the prime of his strength, and he knew these mountains like other men knew the streets of their hometowns. Finally, as the first stars began to appear overhead, Abigail turned her head slowly to look at the man beside her. In the gathering darkness, she could make out his profile, strong and steady, and something about his presence made the tightness in her chest ease just slightly. He did not demand explanations or offer false comfort. He simply sat with her, and that simple act of companionship was the first kindness she had known in days. "I cannot feel my feet," she said, her voice cracking from disuse and cold, the words barely more than a whisper carried away on the wind. Owen turned to look at her properly for the first time, and even in the dim light, he could see that her lips were turning blue, and her skin had taken on the waxy pallor of someone in the advanced stages of freezing. Without hesitation, he stood and bent down, scooping her into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She made a small sound of protest, but lacked the strength to resist, and he could feel how cold she was even through his thick coat. "My cabin is a mile from here," he said, his voice deep and rough from spending days at a time without speaking. "I will take you there. You can decide what comes next after you are warm and fed." Abigail wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she was putting him in danger, that the men who had killed her father might still be tracking her through these mountains, but the words would not come. Instead, she let her head rest against his broad chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat and the warmth that radiated from him even in the bitter cold. She closed her eyes and felt herself being carried through the forest, the rhythm of his footsteps crunching through the snow lulling her into a state somewhere between waking and sleeping. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like something from a dream, a solid structure of hewn logs with smoke curling from a stone chimney. Owen kicked the door open and brought her inside, and the warmth hit her like a physical force, making her gasp, and then whimper as feeling began to return to her frozen extremities in a wash of painful tingling. He set her down in a chair near the fireplace and immediately set about building up the fire, adding logs until the flames roared high and bright. Then he filled a basin with water from a barrel near the door and set it near the fire to warm, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had performed these tasks 1,000 times before. "Your boots need to come off," he said, kneeling before her. "Your feet need to be warmed slowly, or you could lose your toes. I am going to help you." "All right," Abigail nodded, too exhausted to be embarrassed, and Owen worked carefully to unlace her frozen boots and peel away the wet stockings beneath. Her feet were pale and mottled, and he frowned with concern as he examined them, but after a moment he seemed satisfied that they had not frozen beyond recovery. He wrapped them in a blanket and then turned his attention to her hands, which were in similar condition. "What is your name?" he asked as he worked, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they massaged warmth back into her fingers. "Abigail," she said, and then after a moment added, "Abigail Kensington. My father had a homestead about 20 miles east of here, up near the pass." "Had?" Owen asked, and something in his tone told her that he already suspected the answer. "They burned it," she said, and her voice broke on the words, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. "They wanted the land because there is a stream that runs through it, good water year-round, and my father would not sell. So they came in the night and they burned everything, and they killed him, and I ran. I just ran and ran until I could not run anymore." Owen's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his bearded cheek, but his hands remained gentle as he continued working warmth back into her frozen extremities. "Who were they?" he asked. "Men from Lordsburg," she said. "Working for a rancher named Silas Vance. He has been buying up all the land between here and the valley, and he does not care who he has to hurt to get what he wants." The name meant nothing to Owen, who had avoided the towns and their politics as much as possible, but he filed it away for later consideration. For now, this young woman needed food and rest and safety, and those were things he could provide. He rose and moved to the small kitchen area of the cabin, ladling stew from a pot that had been simmering over the coals. The smell made Abigail's stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger, and when he brought her a bowl she ate with shaking hands, burning her tongue in her haste, but unable to slow down. Owen watched her with something like sadness in his gray eyes, recognizing the desperation of someone who had not eaten properly in days. When she had finished 2 bowls and could eat no more, he brought her the basin of warm water and some cloths. "You should wash," he said simply. "I will step outside while you clean yourself and change into dry clothes. There are some things in that chest that might fit you. They belong to my sister." "Belonged?" Abigail asked, picking up on the past tense. "She died 5 years ago," Owen said, his voice carefully neutral. "Fever took her in the winter. She came out here to stay with me for a time, thinking the mountain air would help her lungs. It did not." "I am sorry," Abigail said, and meant it, recognizing the weight of old grief in his words. Owen nodded once and then stepped out into the cold night, closing the door behind him and giving her privacy. Abigail worked quickly, stripping off her ruined clothes and washing away the grime and blood of her journey. The water in the basin turned brown and then gray, and she had to refill it twice from the warming barrel before she finally felt clean. In the chest, she found simple but well-made clothing, a dress of dark blue wool and undergarments that were only slightly too large for her slender frame. She dressed quickly, grateful for the warmth and cleanliness, and then sat back down by the fire, running her fingers through her tangled hair and trying to work out the worst of the knots. When Owen came back inside, stomping snow from his boots, he found her sitting by the fire looking almost like a different person. In the flickering light, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps only 20 or 21, with delicate features and large dark eyes that seemed too haunted for someone so young. She was beautiful in the way that wildflowers are beautiful, fragile but resilient, and something in his chest tightened at the sight of her. "You should sleep," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar feeling. "You can have the bed, I will sleep by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Abigail protested, but Owen was already pulling blankets from a shelf and making himself a pallet on the floor near the hearth. "The bed is yours for as long as you need it," he said in a tone that brooked no argument. "Sleep now. We can talk more in the morning." Abigail wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight, and the bed in the corner looked impossibly inviting. She rose on unsteady feet and made her way across the room, crawling beneath the heavy quilts and feeling the tension begin to drain from her body for the first time in days. The bed smelled of pine and wood smoke and something else, something clean and masculine that she realized must be Owen himself. She meant to stay awake, to think about what she would do next, where she would go, how she would survive. But sleep took her before she could form even a single coherent plan. Owen lay by the fire and listened to her breathing even out and deepen, and he found himself thinking about the men who had burned her home and killed her father. He had left that kind of violence behind when he came to these mountains, had sworn to himself that he was done with killing and revenge, and all the ugliness that men inflicted on each other. But lying there in the darkness, listening to this young woman sleep the exhausted sleep of someone who had been running for her life, he felt the old familiar anger stirring in his chest. Morning came cold and bright, sunlight streaming through the small window and painting everything gold. Abigail woke slowly, confused for a moment about where she was, and then memory came flooding back. She sat up and saw Owen at the small table, working on something with his large hands. He looked up when he heard her moving and nodded a greeting. "There is food on the stove," he said. "Coffee, too." "Help yourself." Abigail rose and found indeed that he had prepared breakfast, simple but nourishing fare of cornmeal mush and bacon. She ate more slowly this time, her body beginning to remember how to function normally after the trauma of the past days. Owen finished whatever he had been working on and came to sit across from her at the table, cradling a cup of coffee in his hands. "Tell me everything," he said simply. "Start at the beginning." So Abigail told him the whole story, beginning with her father's decision to homestead in the mountains 3 years ago after her mother had died. They had been happy there, she and her father, living a simple life and slowly building something they could be proud of. The trouble had started 6 months ago when Silas Vance's men had first come around, offering to buy the land for a fraction of what it was worth. Her father had refused, and the offers had become threats, and the threats had become violence. "They killed our livestock first," she said, her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup, seeking its warmth. Then they burned our barn. My father went to the marshal in Lordsburg, but the marshal is in Vance's pocket. There was nothing he would do. So we tried to hold on, tried to protect what was ours, but there were only 2 of us and so many of them." Her voice broke as she described the night they had come. A dozen men with torches and guns, and how her father had told her to run while he held them off. She had heard the gunshots as she fled into the darkness, had known even then that he was gone, but she had kept running because that was what he had told her to do. Owen listened in silence, his face unreadable, but his hands gripped his coffee cup so tightly that Abigail thought it might shatter. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "You cannot go back there," he finally said. "Not to the homestead and not to Lordsburg. If Vance wanted you dead too, then his men will still be looking for you." "I know," Abigail said softly. "But I have nowhere else to go. No family left, no friends. Everything I had is gone." "You can stay here," Owen said, the words surprising them both. He had not planned to say them, but once they were out, he found he did not want to take them back. "For as long as you need. The mountains are big, and my cabin is hard to find if you do not know where to look. You will be safe here." Abigail looked at him, this stranger who had found her by the frozen stream and brought her to his home, who had asked nothing of her and demanded nothing in return, and felt tears prick her eyes again. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for me?" Owen was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. 8 years ago, I came home from the war to find my family's farm burned and my parents dead. Raiders had come through while I was gone, taking what they wanted and destroying the rest. I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to, so I came to these mountains to die or to start over. I am not sure which I intended at the time. But I know what it is like to lose everything, and I know what it is like to have nowhere to go. So you will stay here and you will be safe, and that is the end of it." The words were gruff and matter-of-fact, but Abigail heard the pain beneath them, recognized the kinship of shared loss. She nodded slowly, accepting his offer, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than words. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Owen went about his usual routines, checking his trap lines, hunting, chopping wood, and maintaining the cabin, while Abigail slowly regained her strength. At first, she did little more than sleep and eat, her body recovering from the trauma it had endured. But as the days passed, she began to help around the cabin, cooking meals and mending clothes and tidying the small space. They spoke little at first, both of them comfortable with silence, but gradually they began to share pieces of themselves. Owen told her about his life in these mountains, about the animals he tracked, and the weather patterns he had learned to read, about the long, lonely winters when he sometimes went weeks without speaking a word aloud. Abigail told him about her childhood before her mother died, about the small pleasures of life on the homestead, about her father's gentle wisdom and the books he had taught her to read. As February gave way to March, and the first hints of spring began to touch the high country, Abigail found herself watching Owen with increasing fascination. He moved through the world with a quiet confidence that came from genuine competence, every action purposeful and efficient. She watched him split wood with powerful swings of the axe, his muscled arms flexing with each strike, and felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. She watched him skin a deer with careful precision, his large hands deft and sure, and found herself wondering what those hands would feel like touching her with tenderness instead of necessity. Owen, for his part, was increasingly aware of Abigail's presence in ways that made him uncomfortable. He had grown accustomed to solitude, had convinced himself that he preferred it, but now his cabin felt different with her in it. It felt warmer somehow, more alive, and he caught himself listening for the sound of her voice, looking forward to meals shared at the small table, finding excuses to be near her. One evening in late March, as they sat by the fire after supper, Abigail asked him about the war. It was a question she had been wanting to ask for weeks but had not found the courage until now. Owen was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames, and she thought he might not answer at all. But then he began to speak, his voice low and heavy with old pain. "I was 18 when I joined up," he said. "Young and stupid and full of ideas about honor and glory, I thought I was going to be a hero. Instead, I spent 4 years killing men who looked just like me, who probably had families just like mine, who probably did not want to be there any more than I did. By the time it was over, I had seen things that no man should see, had done things that no man should do, and I came home different than I left. Harder. Colder. When I found my parents dead and the farm gone, it barely even hurt. I had nothing left inside me to feel with." He paused, and Abigail reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. He looked down at her small hand covering his large one, and something in his chest cracked open just a little. "Coming here helped," he continued. "Being alone, being away from people and their cruelty. The mountains do not lie or cheat or kill for sport. They are honest in their dangers. It made me feel human again, little by little. But I had forgotten what it was like to care about anything beyond my own survival until I found you sitting by that stream." Abigail felt her breath catch at the intensity in his gray eyes as he turned to look at her. "You saved my life," she said softly. "You reminded me why life is worth saving," he replied, and the words hung between them, heavy with meaning. They sat in silence after that, but Owen did not pull his hand away from beneath hers, and Abigail did not remove her hand from his, and the fire crackled and sparked while the night deepened around them. April brought warmer weather and longer days, and with them came a new kind of tension to the cabin. They were constantly aware of each other now, their movements around the small space a careful dance of proximity and distance. When they passed each other, Abigail would feel the heat radiating from Owen's body and find herself wanting to lean into it. When their hands touched in the passing of a plate or a tool, the contact sent electricity racing through them both. One afternoon, Owen came back from checking his traps to find Abigail struggling to carry a bucket of water from the creek. The snowmelt had made the stream run high and fast, and she had slipped in the mud and fallen, soaking herself and losing half the water. She was sitting in the mud looking frustrated and miserable when he found her, and without thinking he bent down and lifted her to her feet, his hand spanning her waist. "You should have waited for me," he said, but there was no reproach in his voice, only concern. "The creek is dangerous this time of year." Abigail looked up at him, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, of the strength in his hand still resting on her waist, of the way his eyes had gone dark as he looked down at her. "I wanted to help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do so much for me, and I wanted to do something for you." Owen's hands tightened on her waist for just a moment, and then he was releasing her and stepping back, putting distance between them. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. "Let us get you back to the cabin before you catch a chill." But as they walked back together, the bucket swinging easily in Owen's hand as if it weighed nothing at all, Abigail felt something shift between them. The pretense that they were simply two people sharing a space out of necessity was beginning to crumble, and what lay beneath was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. That evening, after she had changed into dry clothes and they had eaten supper, Abigail found the courage to say what had been building inside her for weeks. "Owen," she said, and he looked up from where he was oiling his rifle. "I need to tell you something." He set the rifle aside and gave her his full attention, and the weight of his gaze made her heart race. "I know that I am a burden to you," she began, but he started to shake his head in protest. She held up a hand to stop him. "Please, let me finish. I know that I have disrupted your life, and that you never asked for any of this. But I want you to know that I am grateful, not just for saving my life, but for giving me a reason to keep living. These past weeks with you have been the happiest I can remember being since before my mother died. And I think, or at least I hope, that maybe you feel something of the same." Owen stood and crossed the room to her in 3 long strides, and before Abigail could say anything else, he had cupped her face in his large hands and was looking down at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You are not a burden," he said fiercely. "You are the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I can remember. But Abigail, I am not a gentle man. I am rough and I am scarred and I live a hard life in a hard place. You deserve better than what I can give you. You deserve a man who can offer you a proper home and a proper life, not a cabin in the wilderness and a future of uncertainty." Abigail reached up and covered his hands with hers, holding them against her face. "I do not want easy or soft or proper," she said. "I want real. I want honest. I want you, Owen Lawson, exactly as you are, if you will have me." For a moment, Owen simply looked at her, and Abigail could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the struggle between what he wanted and what he thought was right. And then the wanting won, and he was lowering his mouth to hers and kissing her with a desperate tenderness that made her knees go weak. She had been kissed before, quick stolen moments with a boy back when she was 16, but this was nothing like those fumbling attempts. Owen kissed her like she was precious and vital, like she was air and he had been drowning, and she felt herself melting into him, her hands gripping his shirt to keep herself upright. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers and let out a shaky breath. "I am not good at this," he admitted, "at talking about feelings or saying the right things. But I need you to know that what I feel for you is real and it is deep, and it terrifies me because I cannot bear the thought of losing you." "Then do not lose me," Abigail said simply. "Hold on to me and let me hold on to you, and we will figure the rest out together." They stood there in the firelight for a long time, holding each other, and for the first time in years, Owen allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have something good in his life again. The spring continued to unfold around them, and with it came a new dimension to their relationship. They were careful with each other, neither of them wanting to rush or push too fast, but the affection between them was undeniable. Owen began to teach Abigail the skills she would need to survive in the mountains, showing her how to track animals, how to read the weather, how to move silently through the forest. She proved to be an apt student, quick and clever, and Owen felt a fierce pride watching her confidence grow. In turn, Abigail brought softness back into Owen's life in ways he had not even realized he had been missing. She sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth. She insisted they eat meals together at proper times rather than whenever hunger struck, creating a rhythm and structure to their days. She mended his clothes with careful stitches, and made sure he washed regularly and cut his hair when it grew too long, though she insisted he keep it at shoulder length because she loved running her fingers through it. The first time they made love was on a warm night in May, with the windows open and the smell of pine and wildflowers drifting in on the breeze. It was awkward and wonderful and intensely intimate, and afterward, as they lay tangled together in Owen's bed, Abigail felt more at home than she had since before her father died. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, and felt Owen's arms tighten around her. "I love you too," he replied, and the words came easier than he had expected. "More than I thought myself capable of loving anything." They lay there in comfortable silence for a while, and then Owen spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "We should get married," he said. "Proper married, with vows and everything. I know we are already living as husband and wife, but I want to make it official. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours." Abigail propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Are you proposing to me, Owen Lawson?" "I suppose I am," he said, a rare smile crossing his face, "though I am making a mess of it. I have no ring to give you and no fancy words, but I can promise you that I will spend the rest of my life taking care of you and loving you and doing my best to make you happy. Will you marry me, Abigail Kensington?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, and kissed him deeply. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The question became how to actually accomplish such a thing. They were days from the nearest town, and Lordsburg was out of the question given the danger that still lurked there. But Owen remembered hearing about a small settlement called Fairplay about 30 miles south, high in the mountains of Colorado, where a circuit preacher came through once a month. It would mean a long journey, but it would be worth it to do things properly. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the trip, Owen teaching Abigail how to handle a rifle and making sure she could defend herself if necessary. He also spent time scouting the route they would take, making sure they could avoid any of Vance's men who might still be looking for Abigail. Finally, in early June, they set out on horseback, riding south through some of the most beautiful country Abigail had ever seen. The journey took them 5 days, camping at night under the stars and traveling during the daylight hours. Owen was cautious, always watching their back trail, always ready for trouble, but none came. They arrived in Fairplay on a Wednesday afternoon, and Owen immediately sought out the local preacher, a weathered man named Reverend Thomas who agreed to marry them that very evening. The ceremony was simple, held in a small church made of rough-hewn boards, with only a handful of locals as witnesses. Abigail wore the best dress she had been able to make from fabric Owen had traded for, and Owen wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. When the preacher asked if he would take Abigail to be his lawfully wedded wife, Owen's "I will" rang out strong and clear, and when it was Abigail's turn, her voice was equally firm. They exchanged simple gold bands that Owen had purchased from the town's only jeweler, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed her with such tenderness that several of the watching women sighed audibly. That night, they stayed at the town's small boarding house, and Abigail Lawson, as she was now called, fell asleep in her husband's arms feeling safer and more content than she had ever thought possible. They stayed in Fairplay for a few more days, Owen trading furs and meat for supplies they would need, and it was during this time that they heard troubling news. Silas Vance had expanded his operations, buying up more land and pushing out anyone who resisted. There were rumors that he was planning to go into politics, that he wanted to control not just the land but the entire region, and that anyone who stood in his way had a habit of disappearing. Owen listened to these stories with a darkening expression, and Abigail could see the old soldier stirring inside him, the part of him that understood violence and knew how to meet it. But she also saw him push it back down, saw him make the conscious choice to let it go, and she loved him all the more for it. "He cannot touch us where we are," Owen said as they prepared to leave Fairplay, "and we have no reason to ever cross his path. Let him have his empire. We have something better." They rode back to the cabin as husband and wife, and the summer that followed was one of perfect contentment. Abigail thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and brown from the sun, learning to hunt and fish and live off the land. Owen, in turn, found himself laughing more than he had in years, found himself looking forward to each new day instead of simply enduring them. In August, Abigail realized she was pregnant. She waited to be sure before telling Owen, and when she finally did, on a warm evening as they sat outside watching the stars, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession, shock and joy and fear and wonder, and then he was pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Abigail asked, even though she could already see the answer on his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Owen replied, and there were tears on his cheeks that he made no effort to hide. "Terrified might be more accurate. What do I know about being a father? But yes, I am happy. So incredibly happy." The months that followed were a time of preparation and anticipation. Owen threw himself into making the cabin more comfortable and secure, adding a room and building a proper cradle, and doing everything he could think of to make sure his wife and child would be safe and warm. Abigail continued her daily activities as long as she was able, and when the snow came again in November, blanketing their small valley in white, she was content to spend her days inside, sewing clothes for the baby and reading from the small collection of books Owen had accumulated. Winter in the high country was harsh and long, but inside the cabin, there was warmth and love and the quiet joy of two people who had found each other against all odds. Owen was attentive and protective, sometimes annoyingly so, and Abigail had to remind him repeatedly that she was pregnant, not made of glass. But she appreciated his concern even when she pretended to be exasperated by it, and she felt safer and more loved than she ever had in her life. The baby came in March, on a day when the first crocuses were pushing up through the melting snow. Owen had ridden down to Fairplay a week earlier to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, and it was a good thing he had, because Abigail's labor was long and difficult. Owen paced outside the cabin like a caged animal, listening to his wife's cries and feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. But finally, after nearly 20 hours, he heard a new sound, the thin, wailing cry of a newborn, and Mrs. Henderson opened the door and beckoned him inside. "You have a son," she said with a tired smile, "and your wife is asking for you." Owen entered the cabin on shaking legs and found Abigail propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and when she pulled back the blanket to show him their son, Owen felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. The baby was tiny and red-faced, with a wisp of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through him. Owen reached out with one large finger and stroked the impossibly soft cheek, and when the baby turned his head toward the touch, mouth working, Owen let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "He is perfect," he said, looking between his son and his wife. "You are both perfect." They named him James, after Owen's father, and the weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry and overwhelming love. Owen had thought he knew what love was, what it felt like to care for someone more than yourself, but fatherhood opened up entirely new dimensions of emotion. He would stand over the cradle for hours, watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny perfection of him, and feeling a fierce protectiveness that bordered on ferocity. Abigail adjusted to motherhood with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else, though she was often exhausted and sometimes overwhelmed. Owen did everything he could to help, changing diapers and walking the floor with a crying baby and cooking meals while Abigail rested. They were a team, partners in every sense of the word, and their love for each other deepened with every challenge they faced together. As spring turned to summer, and James grew from a tiny newborn to a chubby, smiling baby, they settled into a new rhythm as a family. Owen took James with him on short trips around their property, carrying him in a sling Abigail had made, teaching him about the mountains even though the baby was far too young to understand. Abigail would watch them go, her heart full to bursting, and think about how far she had come from that frozen day by the stream when she had given up hope of ever being happy again. One evening in July, as they sat outside watching James try to crawl on a blanket spread on the grass, Abigail brought up something that had been on her mind for weeks. "Owen," she said carefully, "I have been thinking about my father's land." Owen looked at her, immediately alert to the tension in her voice. "What about it?" "It should have been mine," she said. "By law, as his only heir, that homestead and everything on it belongs to me. Vance had no right to take it, no matter what strings he pulled or which officials he bribed. And I keep thinking, if we just let him get away with it, what does that say? What kind of example is that for our son?" Owen was quiet for a long moment, watching James grab at a tuft of grass and try to put it in his mouth. "What are you suggesting?" he finally asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I want to go to the territorial authorities," Abigail said. "To Denver, where Vance's money and influence do not reach. I want to file a claim and force the government to investigate what happened. It might not work, but I think we have to try. Not for the land itself, but for what it represents. Justice. The idea that powerful men cannot just take what they want and hurt whoever gets in their way." Owen closed his eyes, torn between his desire to keep his family safe in their mountain sanctuary and his understanding of why this mattered to Abigail. She was right, of course. Letting Vance get away with murder and theft was wrong, was a betrayal of her father's memory and an acceptance of injustice. But going after a man like Vance meant putting themselves in danger, and the thought of anything happening to Abigail or James made his blood run cold. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it carefully. We do not go charging in without a plan, and if at any point I think you or James are in danger, we walk away." "Agreed," Abigail nodded, relief washing over her face. "Agreed." They spent the next month preparing, Owen making several trips down to Fairplay to gather information and send letters to the territorial government in Denver. He learned that there was indeed growing concern about land grabbing and violence in the Colorado Territory, and that the governor had appointed a special investigator to look into such matters. Owen wrote a detailed letter outlining what had happened to Abigail's father, naming Silas Vance, and describing the circumstances of the murder and arson. The response came faster than they expected. A letter from the investigator himself, a man named Robert Morrison, saying that he would be traveling to the area in September and would like to meet with them to discuss the case. He suggested they meet in Fairplay rather than Lordsburg, given the sensitive nature of the situation, and Owen agreed immediately. In early September, they made the journey to Fairplay as a family, James now 6 months old and delighting in the adventure of traveling. They met with investigator Morrison in a private room at the boarding house, and Abigail told her story once again, in even greater detail this time. Morrison listened carefully, taking notes, and when she was finished, he leaned back in his chair with a troubled expression. "What you are describing is not an isolated incident," he said. "We have had similar complaints about Mr. Vance and his operations from nearly a dozen different sources. The problem is that he is careful. He uses intermediaries, and he makes sure there are rarely witnesses who survive to testify. Your case is actually one of the strongest we have, because you survived and because there is physical evidence of the arson. But I will not lie to you, Mrs. Lawson. Going forward with this will put you in danger. If Vance learns that you are cooperating with the territorial authorities, he will do whatever it takes to silence you. I understand, Abigail said, and Owen could hear the steel in her voice. But this is not just about me or my father. It is about everyone Vance has hurt and will hurt if someone does not stand up to him. I am willing to take that risk. Morrison looked at Owen, gauging his reaction. And you, Mr. Lawson, are you prepared to protect your family if Vance comes after them? Owen met his gaze steadily. I spent 4 years in a war I did not believe in, protecting people I did not know. You can be damned sure I will do whatever it takes to protect my wife and son. But I would prefer not to handle this alone. What support can the territorial government provide? I can arrange for a federal marshal to accompany you back to your home and maintain a presence in the area while we build our case, Morrison said. And I can assure you that the territorial governor is taking these matters seriously. If we can prove what Vance has done, he will face justice regardless of how much money or influence he has. They talked for another hour, working out the details, and by the time they left the meeting, a plan was in place. A federal marshal named Davis would travel back with them to the cabin and would set up a camp nearby, close enough to respond if there was trouble but far enough to not intrude on their daily lives. Meanwhile, Morrison would continue gathering evidence and building a case, and when he had enough, he would bring formal charges against Vance. The journey back to the cabin with Marshal Davis was uneventful, and Owen found himself cautiously optimistic that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Davis was a competent man in his late 40s, experienced and level-headed, and he understood the seriousness of the situation. He set up his camp about a quarter-mile from the cabin, in a spot with a good view of the approaches, and settled in for what might be a long wait. The weeks that followed were tense. Owen doubled his vigilance, never straying far from the cabin and always keeping weapons close at hand. Abigail went about her daily routines with James, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, but she could feel the strain in the air, the constant watchfulness that had replaced their peaceful existence. Then, in late October, everything came to a head. Owen had ridden down to Fairplay for supplies, leaving Abigail and James at the cabin under Marshal Davis's protection. He had planned to be gone for only 2 days, but on the second day, as he was preparing to leave Fairplay, he overheard a conversation in the general store that made his blood run cold. 2 men were talking about a group of riders who had been asking questions about a woman who had survived the Kensington fire, and about a mountain man who lived somewhere up near Willow Creek. The men were offering good money for information, and one of them had let slip that their boss wanted the matter handled permanently. Owen did not wait to hear more. He threw his supplies onto his pack horse and rode for home at a punishing pace, pushing the animals as hard as he dared. It took him almost a full day of hard riding to reach the cabin, and when he arrived in the early hours of the morning, he found Marshal Davis waiting for him with his rifle ready. "They have not come yet," Davis said quietly, "but I have seen signs. Tracks around the perimeter from yesterday. Someone is scouting the area. I expect they will make their move soon, probably at dawn when they think we will be less alert." Owen felt the old familiar calm settle over him, the battle readiness he had learned in the war, and he quickly began to prepare. He checked and loaded every weapon in the cabin, set up defensive positions, and made sure Abigail understood that she was to take James and hide in the root cellar at the first sign of trouble. She wanted to argue, wanted to stand and fight beside him, but one look at his face told her that this was not up for discussion. "You are our family's future," he told her, holding her face gently in his hands. "If something happens to me, you need to survive for James. Promise me you will hide no matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes. Promise me." Abigail felt tears streaming down her face, but she nodded. "I promise. But nothing is going to happen to you. We are going to get through this together." Owen kissed her then, long and deep, pouring everything he felt into that kiss, and then he turned to prepare for the attack he knew was coming. They came just before dawn, 8 men on horseback, heavily armed and moving with the confidence of people who thought they had the element of surprise. What they did not know was that Owen and Marshall Davis had been waiting for hours, positioned in spots with clear lines of fire, every sense alert and ready. The first shots were fired when the riders were still 50 yards from the cabin, Owen and Davis opening up with their rifles with deadly accuracy. 2 men fell from their saddles before the others even realized they were under fire, and then chaos erupted. The attackers scattered, seeking cover and returning fire, and for several minutes the mountain valley echoed with the crack of gunfire and the shouts of men. Owen fought with cold efficiency, years of training and experience guiding his actions. He did not think about the men he was shooting at as people, only as threats to his family, and he eliminated them with the same ruthlessness he had learned on a dozen different battlefields. Marshall Davis was equally capable, and together they cut down the attackers one by one. In the root cellar beneath the cabin, Abigail huddled with James clutched to her chest, singing softly to him to keep him calm even as tears streamed down her face and her whole body shook with fear. She had promised Owen she would stay hidden, but every gunshot made her flinch, made her imagine the worst, and it took every ounce of willpower she possessed not to throw open the door and run to him. The fight lasted less than 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it was finally over, 6 of the 8 attackers were dead, and 2 had fled into the forest, wounded and in no shape to pose an immediate threat. Owen and Marshall Davis had both sustained minor injuries, cuts and grazes from near misses, but they were alive and functional. Owen stumbled to the cabin and pulled open the root cellar, and Abigail emerged with James, both of them safe and unharmed. She launched herself into Owen's arms, sobbing with relief, and he held her tightly, murmuring reassurances into her hair. "It is over," he said. "They are gone. You are safe." Marshall Davis searched the dead men and found papers that tied them directly to Silas Vance, orders written in Vance's own hand detailing what they were supposed to do. It was exactly the kind of evidence Morrison needed, and Davis rode immediately to Fairplay to send word to the investigator. What followed was a legal whirlwind. Investigator Morrison arrived with a contingent of federal marshals and arrested Silas Vance on charges of murder, arson, conspiracy, and half a dozen other crimes. Vance tried to use his money and connections to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion had turned sharply against him once the full extent of his crimes became known. The trial took place in Denver in the spring of 1880, and Abigail testified about what had happened to her father and their homestead. It was difficult, reliving those terrible days, but Owen sat beside her throughout her testimony, his presence a solid anchor, and she made it through. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict, and Vance was sentenced to 25 years in territorial prison. In the aftermath of the trial, the territorial government restored Abigail's legal claim to her father's homestead, but she and Owen both agreed they had no desire to return there. Too many bad memories hung over that place, and they had built a good life in their mountain valley. Instead, they sold the land to a young family who promised to honor the memory of those who had lived there before, and they used the money to improve their cabin and buy the supplies they needed to be completely self-sufficient. Life settled back into its peaceful rhythms, the drama and danger of the past 2 years fading into memory. James grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who loved exploring the forest with his father and listening to his mother's stories. In the fall of 1881, Abigail gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, and their family felt complete. Owen continued to work his trap lines and hunt the mountains he loved, but now he had something to come home to, a wife who made his house a home and children who filled it with laughter and noise. He had never imagined, on that cold February day, when he found a lost young woman sitting by a frozen stream, that she would become the center of his entire world. But that was exactly what had happened. Abigail had found in Owen everything she had never known she needed: strength and tenderness, protection and partnership, a love that was fierce and constant and unwavering. She had lost everything when she fled into these mountains, but she had gained so much more: a husband who cherished her, children who delighted her, and a life that was simple but rich in all the ways that mattered. Years passed, and their family grew. 2 more children followed Rose, another son named Thomas and a daughter named Clara. The cabin expanded to accommodate them all, rooms added and porches built, until it was less a rough mountain shelter and more a proper home. Owen's hair began to gray at the temples, and Abigail developed laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. But they were both healthy and strong and deeply content with the life they had built together. James, as the eldest, took naturally to the mountain ways, learning to track and hunt and read the weather just as his father had taught him. He had Owen's quiet strength and Abigail's intelligence, and they both knew he would thrive in whatever path he chose. Rose was adventurous and fearless, always climbing trees and catching frogs, and declaring that she was going to explore the whole world someday. Thomas was gentle and thoughtful, more interested in books and drawing than hunting, and Clara was still young enough to be a mystery, though she showed signs of being the most stubborn of them all. On a warm evening in June of 1889, Owen and Abigail sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains while their children played in the yard. James was 14 now, nearly as tall as his father and filling out with muscle from years of hard work. Rose was 8 and currently hanging upside down from a tree branch, much to Thomas's worry and Clara's delight. "You ever think about how different our lives would have been if I had not found you by that stream?" Owen asked, reaching over to take Abigail's hand. Abigail laced her fingers through his, marveling as she always did at how perfectly they fit together. "I try not to," she admitted, "because the only thing I can imagine is that I would have died there, frozen and alone. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Owen said, turning to look at her. "I was just surviving before you came along, going through the motions of living without ever really feeling alive. You gave me back my heart." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Abigail smiled. "We have had a good life, have we not? Despite everything, despite all the pain and fear and struggle, it has been a good life." "The best," Owen agreed. "Better than I ever thought I deserved or hoped for, and it just keeps getting better." James called out something to Rose, who responded by doing some kind of acrobatic flip out of the tree that made both parents' hearts stop for a moment. But she landed safely and ran off laughing. Thomas shook his head at his sister's antics and returned to the book he was reading, and little Clara toddled over to the porch to demand that her father pick her up. Owen scooped up his youngest daughter and settled her on his lap, and she immediately began playing with his beard, something she found endlessly fascinating. Abigail watched them with a full heart. This man, who had once thought himself too hard and damaged to be capable of gentleness, now completely wrapped around the tiny finger of a 4-year-old girl. As the stars began to appear overhead and the children's play grew more subdued with approaching bedtime, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about her father, whose death had been senseless and cruel but whose memory had pushed her to seek justice. She thought about that frozen February day when she had given up hope, and about the quiet man who had sat beside her without demanding anything, offering only his presence and his protection. She thought about all the days and nights since then, the challenges they had faced and overcome together, the love that had grown between them like something wild and strong, rooted deep and reaching high. They had built something real out of the ashes of loss, had created a family and a home in the harsh beauty of these mountains, and every day she woke up grateful for the life they shared. "I love you," she said to Owen, not for the first time and not for the last, but with all the depth and sincerity she felt. "I love you too," he replied, his voice warm and certain, "today and always." The years continued to roll by, bringing with them the usual mix of joys and sorrows, triumphs and setbacks that make up a life. James eventually left the mountains to attend university in Denver, though he returned every summer to help his father and to breathe the high country air. Rose, true to her childhood declarations, became a teacher and traveled throughout Colorado, establishing schools in remote communities. Thomas discovered a talent for drawing and went to study art in San Francisco, sending home beautiful sketches of the sea and the cities. Clara, the baby, surprised them all by becoming a skilled horsewoman and starting a business guiding wealthy tourists through the mountain wilderness. Owen and Abigail watched their children grow and flourish with pride, and when the nest was finally empty, they found themselves enjoying the quiet companionship of just the two of them again. They were older now, their bodies bearing the marks of years and hard work, but their love had only deepened with time, aged like fine wine into something rich and complex. In the summer of 1903, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren, the cabin and surrounding clearing filled to bursting with family and laughter and love. James had married a sensible woman named Catherine and had 3 children of his own. Rose had married a fellow teacher and had 2 daughters. Thomas was still single but brought his artistic friends who marveled at the beauty of the mountains. Clara had married a rancher and was pregnant with her first child. As Owen stood looking around at the gathered family, at the legacy he and Abigail had created together, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He had been so lost when he came to these mountains, so broken by war and loss, convinced that he would live out his days alone. But fate, or providence, or simple chance had brought Abigail into his life, and she had changed everything. He found her in the midst of the celebration, surrounded by grandchildren who were begging for stories, and he worked his way through the crowd to her side. She looked up at him with a smile that was just for him, and he marveled that, after all these years, she could still make his heart skip a beat with just a look. That night, after everyone had retired to tents and makeshift beds scattered around the property, Owen and Abigail walked down to Willow Creek together, the same stream where he had found her so many years ago. The moon was full and bright, turning the water to silver, and they stood on the bank holding hands and remembering. "I was so lost that day," Abigail said softly. "I truly believed I had reached the end of my story, and then you came along and showed me that it was really just the beginning." "Sometimes I still cannot believe my luck," Owen admitted. That I happened to check my trap lines on that particular day, that I took that particular route, that I looked up at just the right moment to see you sitting there. If any one of those things had been different, we might never have met. Then I am grateful for every coincidence and chance that brought us together, Abigail said, leaning into his embrace, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. They stood there for a long time, listening to the creek burble over stones and the wind rustle through the pines. Surrounded by the mountains they both loved and the family they had created. In the distance, they could hear the murmur of voices and occasional laughter from their children and grandchildren, and Owen felt a bone-deep satisfaction with the life they had built. As they walked back to the cabin, arms around each other's waists, Abigail looked up at the stars and thought about how far she had come from that broken, frozen girl by the stream. She had been remade by love, by Owen's steady presence and unwavering devotion, by the children they had raised and the life they had shared. The pain of losing her father would never fully heal, but it had been transmuted into something else, something that honored his memory by living fully and loving deeply, and refusing to let fear dictate her choices. The celebration continued through the next day, and then slowly the family began to disperse, returning to their various lives with promises to visit again soon. Owen and Abigail stood in the doorway of their cabin and waved goodbye to the last wagon, and then they turned to each other with matching sighs of relief and contentment. "It is good to see them," Abigail said, "but it is also good when it is just us again." Owen pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "I was thinking the exact same thing." They spent the rest of the day cleaning up from the celebration, working side by side as they had for so many years, their movements synchronized from long practice. As the sun began to set, they carried chairs out to their favorite spot overlooking the valley and sat together watching the light fade from the sky. "You have any regrets?" Owen asked suddenly, the question catching them both off guard. Abigail considered for a long moment before answering. "I regret that my father did not live to see the life I built," she said finally. "I regret that he never got to meet you or know his grandchildren. But as for the choices I made, the path I took, no regrets at all. This life with you has been everything I could have hoped for and more." "Same," Owen said simply, and then added with a rare smile, "though I do sometimes regret not learning to dance properly. I know you would have liked to waltz at our children's weddings instead of just shuffling around the floor like a bear with sore feet." Abigail burst out laughing at that, remembering indeed Owen's awkward attempts at formal dancing. "You did just fine," she assured him. "And honestly, I would not have you any other way. You are perfect exactly as you are." As the stars began to appear, one by one in the darkening sky, they sat in comfortable silence, hands linked between their chairs. They had faced down death and danger, had built a home and raised a family, had created something beautiful and lasting out of pain and loss. Not bad for a lost girl by a frozen stream and the mountain man who chose to sit beside her in silence, offering nothing but his presence and his protection, and finding in return a love that would last a lifetime. The years that followed brought the inevitable changes that come with aging. Owen's once powerful body began to slow, his joints growing stiff with arthritis and his strength finally beginning to wane. Abigail developed a persistent cough that worried them both until a doctor in Fairplay assured them it was just a sign of years spent breathing mountain air. They adapted, adjusting their routines and accepting help from their children when it was offered, and through it all, their love remained constant. In the spring of 1912, Owen turned 62, and Abigail organized another family gathering to celebrate. It was smaller this time, just their immediate children and grandchildren, but no less joyful. They spent 3 days together, and Owen was content to sit in his chair and let the activity swirl around him, soaking up the presence of the people he loved most in the world. On the last evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Owen and Abigail found themselves alone by the fire once more. It was a familiar scene, one they had enacted thousands of times over the course of their marriage, but it never grew old. "You know what I remember most clearly about that first day," Owen said suddenly, his voice contemplative. "Not what you looked like or what you were wearing, but the expression in your eyes when you finally looked at me. It was like you were drowning and I was air, like you were holding on to consciousness by sheer force of will. And I knew in that moment that I could not walk away, that whatever happened next, I had to help you." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes at the memory. "I remember thinking you must be an angel," she said softly. "Or a ghost, because surely no real person would just sit with me without demanding answers or telling me what to do. You gave me space to breathe, to exist without having to perform or explain, and that gift was more precious than you could possibly know." "We saved each other," Owen said, reaching for her hand. "That is what I believe. We were both lost in our own ways, and we found each other and helped each other find our way back." "Yes," Abigail agreed, squeezing his hand gently. "We did." They sat there until the fire burned down to embers, talking about the past and the present and wondering what the future might hold. They did not speak of death or endings, but both of them were acutely aware that time was finite, that the days they had left together were precious beyond measure. In the summer of 1915, Owen suffered a stroke that left him weakened but still mentally sharp. Abigail nursed him through his recovery with the same fierce devotion he had once shown her, and though he never fully regained his old strength, he learned to adapt. They moved their bedroom to the main floor of the cabin, installed railings wherever they were needed, and continued to live as independently as they could. Their children offered repeatedly to take them in, to move them to more comfortable quarters in town where help would be readily available, but both Owen and Abigail refused. They had built their life in these mountains, and they would end it here too, on their own terms and in their own time. The years passed more slowly now, measured not in grand events but in small daily moments. A sunrise watched from the porch, a meal shared in comfortable silence, the sound of grandchildren's laughter during summer visits, the feel of familiar hands holding each other through long nights. Each moment was precious, savored and stored away in memory. In the early autumn of 1918, Abigail woke one morning to find that Owen had passed away peacefully in his sleep beside her. He looked serene, finally at rest after a life that had demanded so much of him, and though Abigail's grief was sharp and deep, there was also a strange kind of peace in it. He had lived a full life and had died in his own bed, in the home he loved, with the woman he loved beside him. There were worse ways to go. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Colorado, family and friends and people whose lives had been touched in some way by Owen's quiet kindness and unwavering integrity. They buried him on a hillside overlooking Willow Creek. The spot he had once told Abigail was his favorite view in all the world, and she stood beside his grave and spoke of their love and their life together, her voice steady despite her tears. After everyone left, Abigail remained at the cabin for another year, unable to quite bring herself to leave the place that held so many memories. But as winter approached in 1919, she finally accepted that it was time to move on, that she could not maintain the property alone, and that staying there was clinging to the past rather than honoring it. She moved to a small house in Fairplay, close to Rose, who had returned to the area after her husband's death. There she lived out her remaining years surrounded by family, spending her days writing down the story of her life with Owen so that future generations would know what they had shared. She became something of a local legend, the woman who had survived violence and loss to build a life of love and purpose in the harsh mountain country. Abigail Lawson passed away peacefully in her sleep on February 14, 1922, 44 years to the day after Owen had found her sitting by the frozen stream. Her children found her in her chair by the window, a slight smile on her face, her memoirs completed and bound on the table beside her. In her hand was clutched the simple gold wedding band Owen had given her all those years ago in Fairplay, and they buried her beside him on the hillside, reuniting them even in death. The cabin stood empty for a few years, but eventually James moved back to the mountains with his wife, unable to stay away from the place that held his childhood. They restored the property and lived there for the rest of their lives, and after them came one of his sons, and then one of his daughters, keeping the land in the family and maintaining the grave site where Owen and Abigail rested side by side. The story of the mountain man and the lost girl became part of local lore, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables, embellished perhaps, but never losing its essential truth. It was a story about love and resilience, about two broken people who found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful together. It was a story about choosing hope over despair, about the power of simple presence and quiet companionship, about the extraordinary things that can grow from the smallest acts of kindness. And on cold February days, when the wind howls through the mountains and ice crystals form along Willow Creek, some say you can still see them there, a man and a woman sitting together in comfortable silence, their hands linked and their faces turned toward each other, exactly as they were meant to be.